Chapter 1. The Shadow's Ledger. The chill of the stone floors crept through the thin soles of Alara's shoes. It was a constant companion in the Lycan king's palace, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the silence. For 5 years, she had perfected the art of being invisible, a ghost in gray dresses, a whisper of movement in the king's vast, lonely office. Alara Vale, the king's secretary, was a name spoken as often as a forgotten law, which was to say, never. Her pen scratched against the thick, creamy paper of the royal ledger. Scratch, scratch. A tiny, rhythmic rebellion in the quiet. Each stroke was perfect, each letter a soldier standing at attention. Her work was her armor because good work was invisible work. No mistakes meant no notice, and no notice meant survival. From across the grand expanse of the office, King Cale Draven sat behind a desk carved from the heart of a thunderstruck oak. He wasn't reading. He wasn't writing. He just stared. Out the tall, arched window at the mountains that clawed at the sky. He was a statue of barely contained violence. Broad shoulders strained the fine black fabric of his tunic. His dark hair was a bit too long, brushing the collar in a way that seemed untamed. Wild. He carried an aura of stillness that felt more dangerous than any roar. Alara's eyes flickered back to her work. Looking at him for too long was like staring at the sun. It burned. It left spots in your vision. She knew this because she remembered the day his signature had appeared on her father's death warrant. The ink was a stark, angry black, the same color as his heart. A guard's boot scraped the marble outside the door, and Alara's spine went rigid. She didn't look up. She just kept writing, her knuckles white around the pen. The sound of their heavy treads was a constant reminder. A reminder that this silence was fragile, that this peace was a lie. What would they do if they knew what she wrote at night? What secrets did she spill onto the cheap, thin pages of her personal journals? The thought sent a shiver through her, a thrill that was equal parts terror and delight. In this palace of stone and secrets, her journal was the only place she was not a shadow. It was the only place she was real. In those pages, she was not the disgraced daughter of a traitor. She was not the wolfless Omega pitied by the court. In her stories, she was fire and fury. She was a queen. She was free. Cale shifted, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tomb-like room. Alara's pen froze mid-stroke. He was restless tonight. The entire palace felt it. The guards were tense, the air thick with an unspoken anxiety that smelled faintly of ozone, like the promise of a storm. Was he a storm? Or was he the unnerving calm at its eye? She risked a glance. His head was tilted, his jaw tight. His gaze was still fixed on the mountains, but it was sharper now. A predator's focus. She lowered her head, the scent of lemon oil from the polished desk filling her senses. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. It was foolish to stay so late, dangerously stupid. But leaving meant returning to her small, empty room with nothing but the ghosts of her family for company. Here, at least, the danger was a living thing. A breathing monster. It made her own ghosts seem smaller somehow. Less hungry. Finally, the great clock in the hall chimed 10. The sound echoed, deep and final. Time to go. Time to shed the skin of the invisible secretary and become herself again. She blotted the last line of ink, closed the heavy ledger, and stood. Her movements were silent, practiced. She moved toward the door, a wraith in the dim lamplight. Alara. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep in the earth. She stopped dead, her hand hovering over the cold brass doorknob. He had never... In 5 years, he had never spoken her name after hours. Not once. Her entire body felt like a live wire. Don't turn around. Don't look at him. She swallowed. Your Majesty? She asked, her voice a dry whisper. There was a long pause. The silence stretched, thin and tight, until she thought it might snap. The Northern Patrol is late, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A stone dropped into a deep, dark well. I will make a note to follow up in the morning, sire, she said, her voice betraying nothing. Another pause. She could feel his eyes on her back, a physical weight. See that you do, he finally murmured, his tone dismissive. He had already turned back to the window. She was forgotten. Alara pulled the door open and slipped out, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't breathe again until she was safe in the hallway, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a soft, final click. The king was restless, and the northern patrol was late. These were two threads in a tapestry she couldn't see, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that they were about to be pulled, and everything was about to unravel. Chapter 2. The Onyx Throne. The next morning's dread followed Alara from her cold bed to the king's council chamber. It was a grand room, designed to intimidate. Black marble floors gleamed, reflecting the grim faces of the Alpha Lords who gathered there. At the head of it all sat the Onyx Throne. It wasn't just a chair, it was a monument to power, jagged and sharp, like the tooth of some great beast. And on it sat Chaol Draven, looking as if he'd been carved from the same dark stone. Alara stood in her usual place, tucked away in a corner near the wall, with a small desk for her notes. From here, she could see everything, hear everything, and be seen by no one. It was the perfect vantage point for a shadow. Today, the tension from last night had sharpened into something brittle. The air was thin. The lords shifted in their fine furs, their eyes darting toward the king, then quickly away. The grain shipments from the south are being raided, Lord Valerius said, his voice a pompous boom. My people are hungry. We need more guards, Your Majesty. We need action. Chaol didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere beyond the chamber walls. His fingers rested on the arm of the throne, still as a hawk on a branch. You have guards, Valerius, Chaol said, his voice dangerously soft. Perhaps you should train them to fight instead of feast. A ripple of shock went through the assembled lords. Alara's pen flew across her paper, capturing the insult word for word. This was Chaol, not just a king, a blade. He cut right to the bone, leaving his enemies to bleed from 1,000 tiny wounds of pride. She should have admired it, the sheer brutal efficiency of his rule. But all she could see was her mother's face, pale, wasted away. Her spirit eroded by a rejected mating bond, yes, but the final blow had been the shame of being the mate of a traitor, the shame that King Chaol's decree had made official. Her memory flashed. A cold room, her mother turning her face to the wall, whispering, He didn't even read the testimony, Alara. The king just signed it. She hated Chaol. She hated him because his power was absolute and his mercy was non-existent. Just then, the chamber doors burst open. A scout, breathing hard and bleeding from a cut on his cheek, stumbled into the room. He was covered in mud and smelled of wet pine and fear. Your Majesty, he gasped, falling to one knee. The Northern Patrol, they were ambushed. We found them an hour ago. No survivors. The room fell silent, deathly still. And the rebels? Chaol's voice was unnervingly calm, colder than the stone floor. They left a message, sire, the scout said, his hand trembling as he held out a crude, blood-stained banner. The symbol on it was a broken chain. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The broken chain rebels. They were more than just bandits. They were fanatics who believed the Lycan monarchy was a curse on their people. They were notoriously difficult to track, disappearing like smoke into the dense northern forests. This attack was bolder than anything they had done before. It was a direct challenge, a declaration of war. Chaol slowly rose from the onyx throne. He seemed to grow taller, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. He walked down the steps, his boots silent on the marble, and took the banner from the scout. He stared at the bloody symbol, his expression unreadable. But Alara, who had studied him for 5 long years, saw it, a flicker of something in his dark eyes. Not fear, Not anger, something hotter, something that burned. "They grow bold," Lord Valerius blustered. "Send the legions, Your Majesty. Burn them out of those forests." Cale didn't respond. He just kept staring at the banner. The silence stretched. It became a living thing, coiling in the chamber, suffocating them all. What was he thinking? Why wasn't he giving an order? The entire court was watching, waiting for their ruthless king to unleash his wrath. Then he did something that stunned them all. He looked up from the banner, his gaze sweeping over the lords, and said, "I will handle this myself." A murmur of disbelief and confusion swept through the room. "Your Majesty, that is unwise," one of the older alphas protested. "To go after them yourself, it is beneath you. It is a task for your soldiers." "My soldiers are dead," Cale stated, the words like chips of ice. This was a message. It requires a personal reply. He tossed the banner to the floor. "Assemble my personal guard. We ride in an hour." He turned and strode from the room without another word, his black cloak swirling behind him like a storm cloud. The lords were left staring after him, their mouths agape. Alara's mind reeled. The king, going on a hunt himself? It was unheard of. It was reckless. It was personal. Why? Why was this different? She stood frozen in her corner, the quill still clutched in her hand. The broken chain. No survivors. A personal reply. A storm was gathering outside the palace walls, the sky turning a bruised purple. But Alara knew the real tempest was the one that had just walked out of the room. And he was heading north, right into the heart of a war he had just declared. Chapter 3. A king's blood. A secretary's hands' hours bled into one another. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke, throwing sheets of rain against the tall office windows. The wind howled, a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the unease coiled in Alara's stomach. She should have gone home. Her work was done. The ledgers were balanced. The correspondence for the day was filed away in its neat, orderly fashion. But she stayed. She told herself it was because the rain was too heavy. A convenient lie. The truth was, she couldn't leave. Not until she knew. The palace was a hive of nervous energy. Whispers followed her down the corridors. The king went north, alone with only his guard. He's hunting the broken chain. It was madness. The kind of glorious, foolish madness that got kings killed. And for some reason, the thought of that, it didn't bring her the satisfaction she expected. It just left a hollow, aching void in her chest. The fire in the grand hearth had dwindled to glowing orange embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The only other light was the single candle on her desk, its small flame flickering bravely in the gloom. The office felt empty without him, colder, larger. She traced the rim of her inkwell, her thoughts a tangled mess. What did it matter to her if he lived or died? His death meant freedom. It meant the end of the man who had ruined her family. So why did her heart feel like a lead weight in her chest? Crack, boom! Lightning split the sky, followed instantly by a deafening roar of thunder. The entire palace seemed to shake. At the exact same moment, the heavy doors to the office were thrown open, crashing against the stone walls with a violent bang. Alara sprang to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood silhouetted against the stormy darkness of the hallway, tall, broad, but broken, staggering. He took one step into the room, then another. A second flash of lightning illuminated him. It was Cale. But not the king she knew. His fine black tunic was shredded and soaked through with rain and something darker. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his side, his breathing a harsh, ragged sound that was barely audible over the storm. He was alone. Where was his guard? "Your Majesty!" she started, her voice a squeak. He took another lurching step into the room and collapsed. He didn't fall so much as fold in on himself, landing on one knee with a grunt of pure agony. His hand fell away from his side, and in the dim firelight, she saw it. The dark, wet stains spreading rapidly across the white linen of his undershirt. Blood. So much blood. Her mind went blank. Every instinct screamed at her. Run, hide, disappear. This was not her concern. He was the king. He had healers, guards. He was a monster who deserved whatever fate the rebels had dealt him. This was justice, wasn't it? He tried to push himself up, his muscles straining, but a wave of pain racked his body and he fell back against a heavy chair, his head lolling. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound animal pain that it cut through her paralysis. He was dying. Right here, on his office floor, and they were alone. No, she couldn't. She wouldn't. She was the shadow, the ghost. She didn't get involved. Her survival depended on it, but her feet were moving before her brain could stop them. One step, then another. She crossed the vast expanse of the room, her sensible shoes making no sound on the rug. The air grew thick with the coppery scent of his blood. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering, useless. "The healers," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll call the healers." He shook his head, a small, pained movement. "Too late," he rasped, his eyes squeezed shut. Ambush. Again. Her gaze fell to the wound. It was a deep, vicious gash in his side, bleeding freely. He was losing too much, too fast. Her mother had taught her basic field dressing, a lifetime ago, before the shame, before the palace. The memory surfaced, clear and sharp. Pressure, Alara. Always apply pressure. Without thinking, she ripped a piece of fabric from her own gray dress. She balled it up, took a shaky breath, and pressed it hard against the wound. Everything stopped. The storm outside, the crackle of the fire, the frantic beating of her own heart. Everything just ceased to exist. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt, like lightning itself, shot up her arm. It wasn't pain. It wasn't pleasure. It was recognition. A deep, primal hum that vibrated in her very bones. His eyes snapped open, and they weren't the cold, dark brown she knew. They were blazing. Molten gold. The pupils were blown wide, black pits of feral intensity. His head snapped toward her, his nostrils flaring. He inhaled, a deep, shuddering breath, and a sound ripped from his chest. It wasn't a word. It was a growl. A low, possessive, earth-shaking rumble that vibrated through her hands, through her soul. The scent of him filled her senses. Rain, blood, pine, and something else, something wild and ancient and devastatingly male. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing she had ever smelled. His golden eyes locked on hers. The beast within them looked out at her, saw her, truly saw her for the first time. And then his lips, stained with his own blood, parted. He spoke one word, a word that shattered her world, a word that was both a claim and a death sentence. Mine. Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage. The world rushed back in a roar of sound. Heavy boots thundered on the marble floor. Shouts echoed in the vast office. Men in the king's silver and black livery surrounded them, their faces a mixture of shock and alarm. Healers in gray robes pushed Alara aside, their hands already glowing with the soft, warm light of Lycan magic. She stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of her own torn dress. Her hands were sticky with his blood, the king's blood. No one looked at her. No one spoke to her. She was invisible again, and the relief was so sharp it felt like pain. She scrambled to her feet and fled. She didn't stop running until the door to her small, plain room was shut and bolted behind her. She slid down to the floor, her body trembling, and stared at her hands. The blood was already drying, turning brown and flaky. His word echoed in her mind, a brand on her soul. Mine. It wasn't a promise. It was a cage. Sleep did not come. How could it? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his. Not the cold, dark eyes of the king, but the blazing gold eyes of the beast. She saw the raw, undiluted possession in that gaze, and a terror unlike any she had ever known washed through her. This was the curse her mother had warned her about, the bond that trapped you, the bond that could be rejected, leaving you to waste away into nothing. It was a golden leash, and the Lycan king now held the end of it. The summons came with the dawn, a sharp, commanding knock on her door. It wasn't a request. She dressed in a fresh gray gown, her fingers clumsy and stiff. Her reflection in the small mirror was a stranger, a pale, haunted girl with eyes that were too wide and a secret cowering behind them. Walking to his office was the longest journey of her life. The guards outside his door looked at her differently now. Their usual indifference was gone, replaced by a wary curiosity. They saw something on her, a mark she couldn't wash off. She stepped inside. The room had been cleaned. The scent of blood was gone, replaced by the familiar smell of citrus polish and old books. But the memory of it lingered, a ghost in the air. Kyle stood by the window, the same spot as yesterday, but today he wasn't looking out. He was watching her. He looked fine. Lycan healing was a marvel. There was no sign of the gaping wound, only a faint weariness around his eyes and a dangerous tension in his shoulders. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice a little too quiet. She curtsied, her eyes fixed on the floor. "You sent for me." "I did," he said. The gravelly rumble of his voice sent a tremor through her. "Look at me, Alara." It was a command. Slowly, she lifted her head. His gaze was intense, searching. It felt like he could see right through her skin, into the frantic, terrified heart of her. "I trust you are fully recovered, sire," she managed, clinging to the familiar script of their professional relationship. A humorless smile touched his lips. "I am. No thanks to the rebels." His eyes darkened. "And no thanks to my guards, who apparently cannot secure my own damn office." He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "We need to talk about last night." "There is nothing to discuss," she said quickly, her panic rising. "I merely did my duty until the healers could arrive." "Your duty?" he repeated, his voice low and laced with disbelief. "Is that what you call it?" He reached out, and before she could flinch away, he gently took her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, right where his blood had dried. A spark, warm and electric, shot up her arm. "When you touched me, I felt it, and you felt it too. Don't lie to me." She snatched her hand back as if burned. "I don't know what you're talking about." His eyes narrowed. "You are the first thing I have felt in years, Alara. Hope, warmth, anything. Do you have any idea what that means?" "It means nothing," she insisted, her voice cracking. "It's a mistake, a biological trick. It is not real." She took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Your Majesty, I wish to tender my resignation, effective immediately." Silence. For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh that held no joy at all. "Resignation?" He stalked closer, backing her up against the cold, unyielding wood of her own desk. He leaned in, placing his hands on either side of her, trapping her. "After last night, after I scented my own fated mate bleeding out on my floor, you think you can just walk away?" He shook his head, his dark hair falling over his brow. "No." The word was absolute, an iron door slamming shut. "You can't keep me here," she whispered, her defiance a flickering candle against his hurricane. "I can," he growled, his voice dropping to a possessive murmur that vibrated through her bones. "And I will. You are not going anywhere. There is a royal summit tonight with visiting alphas from all the territories. You will be there, by my side." His gaze was a physical touch, pinning her in place. "Your life as a shadow is over?" Chapter 5. The Serpent's Gaze. Being dressed for the summit felt like being prepared for a sacrifice. Maids who had never given Alara a second glance now fussed over her, their hands gentle but their eyes wide with a terrifying mix of awe and fear. They dressed her in a gown of deep sapphire blue, a color she would never have chosen. It was the color of a midnight sky, the color of royalty. It felt like a costume, a lie. The dress was beautiful, but to Alara, it felt like the finery of a prized pet, chosen by its owner. When she walked into the great hall, 100 conversations stuttered to a halt. 100 pairs of eyes turned to her. It was a physical blow, a wave of scrutiny so intense it made her want to shrink back into the shadows she knew so well. But the shadows were gone. Kale stood waiting for her by the entrance, and he held out his arm. It was not a request. It was a command for the entire world to see. Her hand trembled as she placed it on his sleeve. The fabric was warm, and beneath it, his arm was like solid steel. The great hall was a sea of jewels and furs. Visiting alphas, lords, and ladies from every corner of the Lycan territories mingled and postured. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine, roasted meat, and ambition. It was a serpent's nest, and Kyle had just thrown her right into the middle of it. He led her toward the 2 thrones on the dais, forcing her to walk the length of the hall under the relentless gaze of the court. The whispers followed them like rustling leaves. Is that her? The secretary? A wolfless omega. The moon goddess must be mad. Look at the king. I've never seen him look at anyone like that. Alara kept her eyes forward, her chin high, her face a carefully constructed mask of calm. But inside, she was screaming. Kyle guided her to a smaller chair placed just to the side of his throne, close enough for everyone to understand. She belonged to him. The thought was suffocating. Throughout the initial greetings, he was the perfect king. Gracious, commanding. But his attention was never fully on the alphas who bowed before him. Alara could feel it, a constant, low-level awareness that was focused entirely on her. His fingers would brush hers as he reached for a goblet. His shoulder would press against hers as he leaned over to speak with a lord. Each touch was a spark on her skin, a reminder of the bond that hummed between them. It was a warmth she didn't want, a connection her very soul screamed to reject, because she could feel it trying to lull her into a false sense of safety. Lord Valerius, the pompous alpha from the council meeting, approached with 2 other lords. He bowed stiffly to Kale, but his eyes, small and cruel, were fixed on Alara. A bold choice of companion for such an important summit, Your Majesty, Valerius said, his voice slick with false deference. I choose my companions as I see fit, Kale replied, his tone glacial. Valerius gave a thin, unpleasant smile. He turned to his companions, but he spoke just loud enough for Alara to hear. The traitors get... It seems the Vale bloodline is good for something after all. Who knew it could bewitch a king? Ice flooded Alara's veins, her father's shame thrown in her face, the mask she wore so carefully cracked. Before she could even react, a sound came from Kale's throne. It was a low, terrifying growl that vibrated through the stone dais. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a predator promising death. Kale's hand shot out and gripped the arm of his onyx throne, his knuckles turning white. The wood groaned under the pressure. Valerius's face went pale. He had overstepped. He had prodded the beast, and the beast was awake. Kyle didn't say a word. He just stared at Valerius, his eyes beginning to gleam with that terrifying golden light. The message was clear. Say another word, and you die. The Lord and his friends backed away, bowing hastily and melting back into the crowd. Kyle slowly relaxed his grip on the throne. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Alara's. The gold in his eyes softened, just for a second. He was a monster, a ruthless, terrifying king. But he had just defended her honor. The contradiction was a dizzying blow. He was the source of her family's pain, and yet he was the only one in this room who had protected her from it. As the summit continued, with speeches and political maneuvering, Alara felt a new kind of dread settle over her. This wasn't just about a fated bond anymore. Her presence here, at his side, was a political statement, a weakness for his enemies to exploit. She was a liability, a target. And as that thought crossed her mind, a prickle of cold fear traced its way up her spine. The distinct, unnerving feeling of being watched. She scanned the crowd of smiling, venomous lords, but this felt different. It wasn't the gaze of a gossip. It was the focused, patient stare of a hunter. Chapter 6. A Shield of Flesh and Fury. That chilling sensation of being watched did not fade. It clung to Alara like a spider's web, a cold, invisible threat in the warm, crowded hall. Her eyes scanned the room, moving past the clusters of gossiping nobles and the stoic guards lining the walls. She searched the high-shadowed galleries where the musicians played, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, the feeling persisted. It was a silent scream at the back of her mind, a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed. It told her she was in danger. Kyle was at the center of the dais, making a formal address to the visiting alphas. His voice filled the hall, a powerful, commanding sound that demanded respect. And the territories will stand united against this rebel threat. Any who harbor them will be considered an enemy of the crown. Any who aid them will be met with absolute twang. The sound was small, almost insignificant in the grand hall. The sharp, metallic note of a high-tension string being released. But in the sudden, ringing silence of Alara's focused fear, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Time seemed to warp, stretching out like pulled honey. Her head snapped up toward the gallery. She saw it, a glint of dark metal, a crossbow, quickly being pulled back into the shadows. Her eyes followed the path of its unseen projectile. The short, thick bolt was a black streak, a hornet of death cutting through the air. And it wasn't flying toward the king on his throne. It was flying directly at her. The realization was a punch of ice to the gut. Why me? There was no time to scream, no time to move. Her life, which she had so carefully guarded by being invisible, was about to be snuffed out because she had finally been seen. But Kale had seen it too. Or maybe he had felt it through the humming electric wire of the bond that connected them. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He simply reacted. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, he was no longer a king. He was a blur of black fabric and pure, primal instinct. He crossed the dais in a single explosive movement, shoving her with a force that sent her tumbling to the floor behind the massive onyx throne. He covered her body with his own, a shield of flesh and fury. Thud. The sound was sickeningly wet and solid. The bolt found its mark. Alara felt a tremor run through the heavy body covering her, a pained, sharp intake of breath. Then a low, guttural snarl of absolute rage that was not entirely human. The court erupted into chaos. Lords and ladies screamed. Guards shouted orders, their swords drawn as they swarmed the gallery. Kyle pushed himself up, his movements stiff. The crossbow bolt was embedded deep in the muscle of his shoulder, the black fletching stark against the fine fabric of his tunic. Blood, dark and thick, was already soaking the material. He ignored it completely. He ignored the chaos, the screams, the entire world. His golden eyes, blazing with the fire of his inner beast, were locked on her. He reached down, his hand surprisingly gentle, and pulled her to her feet. He was hurt. He was bleeding. For her. The thought was a dizzying, terrifying thing. He looked her over, a frantic, desperate search for any injury. Finding none, some of the wildness in his eyes subsided, replaced by a possessive fire that was just as frightening. He pulled the bolt from his own shoulder with a grunt, tossing the bloody thing to the marble floor with a clatter. And then, in front of the horrified, silent court, in front of every alpha, every lord, every single person whose opinion mattered, he raised his hand. Not his clean one. The one stained with the blood he had just shed for her. He gently, deliberately, cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, leaving a warm, crimson smear. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a brand, a public declaration more binding than any words. The whispers started instantly, a fire catching in dry grass. He bled for her. He took an arrow meant for his secretary. The wolfless Omega. She is his. Elara stared up into his furious, protective gaze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked past him, at the sea of calculating, shocked, and envious faces of the court. Her old life wasn't just over. It hadn't just faded away. It had been publicly executed right here in the Great Hall, and she was left standing in the ashes, branded by a bloody hand and chained to a king. There was no going back. There was no escape. Not anymore. Chapter 7. The Gilded Prisoner. The aftermath of the summit was a blur of controlled chaos. The Great Hall was cleared, the visiting alphas placated with promises of a swift investigation, but the real change happened in the quiet corridors of the royal wing. Elara was escorted by two of Kale's personal guards, massive, silent Lycans whose eyes missed nothing. They did not lead her back to her simple, solitary room. Instead, they took her to a heavy, carved door she had never passed through before. It was directly adjacent to the king's own chambers. One of the guards opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The rooms within stole her breath. They were beautiful. A sitting room was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with a plush velvet sofa and a fireplace already crackling with a warm, inviting blaze. The connecting bedchamber held a 4-poster bed so large it could sleep a family, draped in heavy silk curtains the color of her new sapphire gown. It was a sweet fit for a queen. And the windows, she noted with a sinking heart, were latticed with elegant but undeniably strong ironwork. It wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage. For the rest of the night and all through the next day, she was a prisoner of this luxury. Servants brought her meals on silver trays, bowing so low their foreheads nearly touched the floor. Maids laid out a dozen new gowns for her in rich fabrics she had only ever dreamed of touching. But the guards never left her door. She was never, ever alone. The court, which had once ignored her, now seemed to orbit her. Lords sent gifts. Ladies sent inquiries about her health. It was a suffocating, dishonest dance, and she hated every second of it. She had gone from being a ghost to being a spectacle. Late that evening, he came. He didn't knock. The door simply opened, and Kyle stepped inside, filling the space with his overwhelming presence. He had shed his formal kingly attire for a simple black tunic and trousers that did nothing to hide the raw power of his body. He looked her over, his dark eyes taking in the fancy room, the uneaten food on the tray, the rigid set of her shoulders. "You are not comfortable," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I am a prisoner," she shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. "Did you expect me to be comfortable?" His jaw tightened. "You are being protected. There is a difference." He walked further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the ironwork on the windows. "They tried to kill you, Elara. Right in front of me. Do you think I will simply allow them a second chance?" "I don't want your protection." The words burst out of her, fueled by days of fear and frustration. "I survived for 5 years in this palace without it. I survived by being quiet, by being nothing. You—" She pointed a trembling finger at him. "You have destroyed that. You have painted a target on my back. That target was painted the moment you touched me." He roared, his control finally snapping. The king was gone, and the beast was at the surface. "This is not a game. The bond chose you. It chose us. You think I wanted this? To find my mate in the daughter of a man my own house condemned? To feel this thing for a woman who looks at me with nothing but hatred in her eyes?" He stalked toward her, and she backed away until her shoulders hit the wall, the thick, woven tapestry scratching her skin. "I want my life back," she whispered, her defiance crumbling into desperation. "This is your life now," he bellowed, his voice a physical force. He slammed his hands against the wall on either side of her head, the impact making the tapestry jump. He leaned in close, his face just inches from hers. The scent of him, pine and fury and that wild, untamed scent that was uniquely his, enveloped her. His chest rose and fell with his ragged breaths. The golden flecks in his dark eyes were beginning to burn. He was a storm about to break, and she was trapped directly in its path. And it is my duty to protect it, whether you like it or not. Chapter 8. The Alpha's Claim. The next day, Alara found herself in the king's council chamber once more. The air was still thick with the memory of Kael's fury. He had left her room the night before without another word, leaving her trembling and breathless, trapped between the wall and the ghost of his rage. Now she was seated in a new permanent chair to the right of the onyx throne. It was another declaration, another bar on her cage. She felt the eyes of every Alpha Lord on her, judging, resenting. The topic of discussion was the northern territories. The lands were wild, and the packs there were fiercely independent. Their leader was a powerful, ambitious Alpha named Lord Vorlag. He was a big man, with hair the color of rust and a beard that couldn't hide the cruel set of his mouth. He had been at the summit, and Alara remembered his eyes on her, cold and calculating. "The broken chain rebels use your lands as a staging ground, Vorlag," Kael said, his voice deceptively calm. "They raid the southern roads and retreat into your forests. Your patrols see nothing. Why?" Vorlag stood, his expression one of arrogant defiance. "My lands are vast, Your Majesty. My wolves are loyal. Perhaps the rebels are simply more clever than your southern soldiers." The insult hung in the air. Kael's fingers tapped a slow, dangerous rhythm on the arm of his throne. "My soldiers are dead, Lord Vorlag, a fact I am sure you have not forgotten." Vorlag's gaze slid from Kael to Alara. A slow, contemptuous smirk spread across his face. "Perhaps Your Majesty's attention has been distracted as of late," he drawled, his eyes raking over her. "We in the north believe a Lycan's strength comes from the purity of his line. It is unwise to be seen with tainted blood." He spat the last words, his meaning as clear as a blade to the throat. A collective gasp went through the chamber. It was a direct, unforgivable insult. Not just to her, but to the king himself. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. The old shame, the familiar humiliation washed over her. But before she could even process the sting, Kael moved. He didn't just stand up, he exploded. One moment he was on the throne, the next he was a black blur of supernatural speed. The air crackled. A low, guttural snarl echoed off the stone walls, a sound that promised a bloody, violent death. He crossed the chamber floor in a heartbeat, his hand shooting out and wrapping around Vorlag's throat, lifting the bigger man clear off his feet. The council was frozen in absolute terror. Vorlag choked, his face turning a dark, mottled purple, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. Kael's eyes were no longer human. They were pure, blazing gold. His canines had elongated, sharp points of white against his snarling lips. This was not the king. This was the beast. And it was about to rip a man's throat out in the middle of the council chamber. No one moved. No one dared. They were all paralyzed by the raw, murderous fury of their king. And in that moment of stunned silence, a single sound cut through the air, a desperate, involuntary cry. "Kael!" It was her voice. She hadn't meant to say it. His name, not his title. It just came out. A plea, a terrified command. The beast froze. Kyle's head snapped toward her, his golden eyes wide with shock. The sound of his own name, spoken by her, seemed to penetrate the red haze of his rage. The fury in his eyes warred with a dawning confusion. He blinked, and for a second, the gold flickered, revealing the dark brown beneath. He dropped Vorlag. The northern alpha crashed to the floor, gasping and sputtering, clutching his bruised throat. Kyle stood over him, his chest heaving, his body still thrumming with violent energy. He stared at Alara, his expression a chaotic storm. He had just revealed the monster he kept caged inside, and she had been the one to call it back. Without another word, he turned and stalked out of the chamber, his powerful shoulders rigid with tension. The meeting was over. The council lords scrambled to their feet, avoiding her gaze as they hurried away, their fear a palpable thing in the air. Ilara was left alone in the sudden, deafening quiet, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on her. She had power over him, a strange, terrifying influence that could soothe the savage beast. The question was, what in the world was she supposed to do with it? Chapter 9. Whispers in Vellum. To escape the suffocating weight of the court's fear and the intensity of Kale's gaze, Ilara sought sanctuary in the one place she was sure no one would follow: the royal archives. It was a dusty, silent world, smelling of old paper, leather, and time itself. The endless shelves of scrolls and leather-bound ledgers were a comfort. Here, the only voices were the whispers of the past, and they were far less dangerous than the whispers in the palace corridors. She set to her task, recataloguing old trial transcripts, a tedious job no one else wanted. It was perfect. It was work that allowed her to be invisible again, if only for a few hours. Her fingers, stained with a bit of ink, traced the spines of the heavy books. She worked her way back through the years, her movements mechanical. 5 years, 10, 15, and then she found it. The section detailing the trials held 20 years ago, the year her father was executed. Her breath hitched. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. It was poison, ripping open a wound that had never truly healed. But her hands had a will of their own. They pulled the heavy ledger from the shelf, its leather cover cracked and worn. She opened it on a dusty table, the pages releasing a faint, musty scent. There it was. The Crown versus Lord Alistair Vale. Her father's name written in the precise, elegant script of the court scribe. She forced herself to read it. The lies, the accusations of treason, of selling pack secrets to rogue shifters, the lists of evidence, which she knew had been fabricated. It was a familiar, bitter story, a story that had defined her entire life. She ran her finger down a list of witnesses scheduled to testify for the prosecution. Most were strangers, names she didn't recognize. And then one jumped out at her, Captain Maddox of the merchant ship the Werewolf. Ilara frowned. That wasn't right. Captain Maddox wasn't an enemy. He had been a friend of her father's, a loud, boisterous man who brought her candies from the southern ports. He had often spoken of her father's loyalty to the crown. He would have defended Alistair Vale. He never would have testified against him. Why was his name on the prosecution's list? Her eyes scanned the dense handwritten text of the transcript. She read about the trial, the verdict, the sentence. But there was no mention of Captain Maddox's testimony. He was listed as a key witness, but his words were nowhere in the official record. Curious, she flipped to the clerical appendices at the back of the ledger. These were the scribe's informal notes, records of scheduling, payments, and other mundane details. She ran her finger down the page and then she found it. A small, almost insignificant note, scrawled in the margin next to the captain's name. Witness deceased. Tavern fire, 2 days prior to scheduled testimony. Ruled accidental. A chill, completely unrelated to the archive's cold, slicked down her spine. A fire. 2 days before he was meant to testify. A key witness, a man who could have proven her father's innocence, had just accidentally died? It was too neat. Too perfect. It was the kind of neat, perfect accident that happened when powerful people wanted a problem to disappear. This wasn't proof. It wasn't a confession. It was just a loose thread in a tapestry of lies that had been woven for 20 years. But it was the first thread she had ever been able to grasp. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced through the certainty of her grief. What if her father hadn't just been a victim of a harsh king's justice? What if he had been the victim of something far more sinister? What if he was framed? The ledger suddenly felt heavy, dangerous. This wasn't just a record of the past. It was a secret, a weapon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm of fear and a new, burning hope. Creak. The sound of the archive's door opening made her jump, a startled gasp escaping her lips. She slammed the heavy ledger shut, her hands shaking as she tried to shove it back into its slot on the shelf. Had someone seen her? Did they know what she had found? She spun around, her back pressing against the shelves. Cale stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the brighter light of the hallway. His face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed. He said nothing. He just stood there, watching her, and a single, terrifying question screamed through her mind. Had he followed her? And if so, why? Chapter 10. A Serpent's Bargain. The silence in the archive stretched, thin and sharp. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in her own chest. Kyle stood in the doorway, a shadow she couldn't read, and for a terrifying moment, she was certain he knew, that he could see the treasonous questions swirling in her mind, that he could smell the scent of old, dangerous secrets on her skin. But his expression, when he finally stepped into the dim light, was not one of accusation. It was tight, annoyed. "I have been looking for you," he said, his voice a low grumble that seemed to vibrate the very shelves. "You have a visitor." Alara blinked, the fear receding into a wave of confusion. "A visitor? I don't—" "Lord Vorlag," Cale cut her off, and the name came out like a curse. "He has requested a private audience. With you." The confusion curdled back into alarm. Vorlag? After Cale had nearly choked the life out of him? Why would he want to see her? "With me? I don't understand." "Neither do I," Kyle snarled softly, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "He is a snake, Alara. Do not forget that." He gestured for her to precede him out of the archives. "I have granted his request. We will meet in the Winter Garden. I will be nearby." The unspoken threat was obvious. "I will be listening, watching." The Winter Garden was a beautiful, lonely place, a glass-walled room filled with hardy plants that bloomed even in the coldest months. Vorlag was waiting for her by a fountain carved in the shape of a sleeping wolf. He smiled when he saw her, a wide, predatory smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He was dressed in rich northern furs, and he bowed with a flourish that was both mocking and elegant. "Lady Alara," he began, his voice a smooth, deep purr. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I must apologize for our misunderstanding in the council chamber." "You insulted my family, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I spoke the truth as the world knows it," he countered, taking a step closer. "But perhaps the world is wrong. You are clearly a woman of great influence." His gaze was unnervingly direct. "The king keeps you beside him like a pretty jewel in a box, but jewels are meant to be seen, to be set free." She stood her ground. "What do you want, Lord Vorlag?" "I want to see a tyrant fall," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Draven is not his father in name, but the blood is the same. He rules through fear. He cages what he desires." His eyes flickered toward the glass walls, a clear indication that he knew they were being watched. "He'll destroy you, little bird. He will keep you in this beautiful cage until your wings forget how to fly, just like his father destroyed yours." The words were a poison dart, aimed directly at the heart of her deepest fears. "I can offer you an alternative," Vorlag continued, his voice hypnotic. "A way out. My territories in the north are a world away from here, a place where a woman of your spirit would be valued, not locked away. I can give you protection. I can give you freedom." "In exchange for what?" she asked, her voice barely audible. His smile widened. "Loyalty. Information. You are the king's shadow. You know his movements, his plans, his weaknesses." He paused, letting the treasonous words hang in the air. "Help me weaken him, and when he falls, I will give you a new life. A life where the name Vale is honored, not whispered in shame." It was a serpent's bargain. a choice between the monster she knew and the one she didn't. The temptation was a bitter taste in her mouth. To be free of the bond, of Kyle, of this palace that was both a sanctuary and a prison, it was a powerful lure. She looked from Vorlag's cunning, expectant face toward the distant palace wall. On a high stone balcony, a lone, dark figure stood watching them. Kyle. Even from this distance, she could feel the possessive fury rolling off him like heat from a fire. Vorlag was offering her a key, but she knew with chilling certainty that both doors led to a cage. Chapter 11. The Tyrant's Signature. The serpent's offer echoed in Alara's mind for days. Freedom. The word was a constant, seductive whisper. It made her more desperate, more reckless. She had to know the truth. Was Kale truly his father's son? Was Vorlag's venomous promise the only escape she had? The answer, she knew, was not in the public archives. It was in a place she had never dared to go, the sealed royal archives, hidden deep in the oldest part of the castle. It was a place of secrets, guarded by locks and legends. But 5 years as the king's shadow had taught her things. She knew the guard patrols changed at the third bell after midnight. She knew that the old librarian was deaf in his left ear, and she knew of a loose window latch in a forgotten storeroom that opened onto the archive's narrow outer ledge, a place no one had bothered to repair because no one believed anyone would be foolish enough to use it. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, Alara became a thief. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped through darkened corridors, a ghost in her own home. The climb along the ledge was terrifying. The wind whipped at her plain wool dress, trying to tear her from the cold stone. One slip, and she would be a broken thing on the courtyard paving stones below. But the need to know was greater than her fear. She slid through the window, landing silently in the pitch-black, dusty room. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten history. Using a small flint and striker, she lit a single shielded candle. The tiny flame pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing shelves groaning under the weight of secrets. She found the section labeled Veil with trembling fingers, and inside a locked, iron-strapped box, she found it. Her father's private file. She broke the brittle 20-year-old wax seal. Her hands shook so badly she could barely lift the papers. There were letters, transcripts of coerced testimonies from men who later disappeared. And then, a missive that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was a letter from the former king, Kale's tyrannical father, addressed to a Lord Valerius, the same pompous lord from the council. It laid out the entire conspiracy. The plan to frame Lord Vale, to seize his lands and make an example of him to quell dissent. Valerius had orchestrated the whole thing. And then, she saw the execution order. It was just as she remembered. The stark black ink, the damning words, and at the bottom, Kale's signature. Bold, unflinching. Her hatred, familiar and sharp, rose in her throat. But then her eyes caught something else, something she had never seen before. Scrawled just above Kale's signature, in the spidery, cruel handwriting of his father, was a note. It was not part of the official decree. It was a personal, brutal message from one king to his heir. Sign this, or I will bring your precious mother's head to you on a platter. Let this be your first lesson in what it means to be king. The world tilted on its axis. The candle flame wavered. Kyle, he hadn't been a monster. He had been a boy. A brand new king, barely older than she was now, forced to choose between the life of an innocent man and the life of his own mother. The man she had spent a decade hating. He had been a victim too. The burning hatred that had been the foundation of her life for so long didn't just fade. It shattered, leaving behind a confusing, aching emptiness that felt terrifyingly like sympathy. A distant sound, the clang of a guard's armor in the main hall, jerked her back to reality. Panic seized her. She couldn't leave the letter. It was the only proof. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled as she pulled the single damning page from the file. Shoving it into the bodice of her dress, she closed the box, extinguished her candle, and fled back toward the window, her heart pounding with the terrifying weight of the truth. She hadn't just stolen a piece of paper, she had stolen a king's secret. Chapter 12. A Human Heartbeat. Elara made it back to the gilded cage of her rooms just as the first gray light of dawn was staining the sky. She didn't sleep. She paced, back and forth, across the plush carpets, the stolen letter a piece of burning ice tucked against her skin. Her mind was a maelstrom. The image of the tyrant king's cruel words was burned into her memory. Kale wasn't the villain of her story. He was a fellow survivor of the same monster. The knowledge changed everything, twisting her hatred into a knot of confusion, pity, and a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of understanding. The door opened without a knock. Kyle stood there, already dressed for the day. He took one look at her wild eyes, her disheveled state from a sleepless night, and his face hardened into a mask of suspicion. "What is it?" he demanded. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she lied, her voice thin. She stopped pacing and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to appear calm, trying to shield the letter hidden in her dress. "Do not lie to me," he growled, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "You have been on edge for days. You reek of fear. And something else? Secrets." He stalked toward her, his eyes narrowed. "You were in the sealed archives last night, weren't you?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. "What were you looking for?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't reveal she knew his deepest shame. So she did the only thing she could think of. She attacked. "I was looking for a way to understand the monster who holds me captive," she cried, her voice trembling with a storm of emotions. "You talk of protection, but this is ownership. You are just like him, just like your father." The blow landed. She saw the flash of deep, profound pain in his eyes before it was swallowed by a tidal wave of fury. "You know nothing about my father," he roared, advancing on her until her back was once again pressed against the wall. "You know nothing about me." "I know that you are a tyrant who cages people," she shot back, her own pain and confusion making her cruel. "And you are a coward," he thundered, his voice cracking with a pain she was only just beginning to understand. "You hide from the bond. You hide from what is right in front of you. You judge me from your fortress of self-pity without ever knowing the truth." The argument had pushed them impossibly close. They were chest to chest, their harsh breaths mingling in the small space between them. The anger was a fire, but beneath it, something else was smoldering. A raw, desperate need. His fury seemed to melt away, leaving behind a look of such profound loneliness that it broke her heart. "You have no idea," he whispered, his voice hoarse with unshed grief. He raised a hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a touch so gentle it made her want to weep. His eyes were dark pools of want and despair. "No idea what it's like, to be completely alone, and then to finally find—" He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. This was it. The moment she had been dreading and a secret part of her admitted, craving. Time seemed to stop. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of leather and ozone, and the clean, masculine scent that was just him. But as his lips were about to touch hers, his whole body went rigid. A pained grunt was torn from his throat. His control, stretched thin by the argument, by the bond, by a lifetime of repression, snapped. The hand cupping her face spasmed. His nails, which had been blunt and human a second before, elongated into sharp black points. They grazed her skin. It didn't break the surface, but she felt the needle-sharp tips of his claws. He jerked his hand back as if her skin had burned him. He stared at his own fingers, at the monstrous points that had emerged without his command, and a look of pure, agonizing self-loathing washed over his face. The beast had surfaced, and he was horrified. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a shattering vulnerability. "You see?" he whispered, his voice broken. "This is what I am. This is the monster I fight every single day. He took a ragged, shuddering breath, the confession torn from the deepest part of him. You're the only thing keeping me human. And then he was gone, turning and striding from the room before she could find her voice. She was left alone, her hand pressed to her cheek where the tips of his claws had rested, the stolen letter still nestled against the frantic human heartbeat in her chest. Chapter 13. The Monster and the Mirror. The ghost of his claws on her skin was a constant, terrifying reminder. Cale's whispered confession, "You're the only thing keeping me human," echoed in the silent, lonely suite of rooms he had given her. The stolen letter, tucked away in a loose floorboard beneath her bed, was a heavy secret that rewrote her entire life. He wasn't the villain she had imagined. He was a boy who had been given an impossible choice. A king chained to the ghost of his monstrous father. He was, she realized with a dizzying lurch of her heart, just as much a prisoner as she was. That single shattering thought changed everything. The fear that had been her constant companion for days began to shift, transmuting into something else, something frightening and new. Empathy. She looked in the mirror and saw her own haunted eyes, and for the first time, she recognized the same trapped soul that lived behind Cale's cold, hard stare. The bond between them was no longer just a terrifying external force. It was a shared wound, and in that moment, a quiet, steely resolve took root in her heart. She would stop running from him. She had to understand him. But just as she made this choice, he pulled away. Ashamed of his loss of control, terrified of the beast he had revealed, Cale became a ghost himself. He retreated behind the unbreachable walls of his kingship. He stopped visiting her rooms. He sent orders through guards. At the few public functions she was still required to attend, he treated her with an icy, distant formality that was more painful than any argument. He was pushing her away, trying to protect her from himself. He was building his cage back up, stone by painful stone. She would not allow it. One cold afternoon, she saw him from her window, standing alone in the training yard. He was watching his soldiers spar, but his focus was a million miles away. His shoulders were slumped with a weariness that went beyond the physical. He looked utterly, devastatingly alone. This was her chance. She ordered a tray of hot spiced tea from the kitchens, a small human comfort against the biting wind. With the tray in her hands, she walked out into the yard. The guards tensed as she approached him, but they did not stop her. Cale didn't turn. He knew she was there. She could feel his awareness of her, a tense, thrumming energy in the air. She stopped beside him, the steam from the tea making little clouds in the frigid air. The sounds of sparring, the clang of steel, the grunts of exertion, filled the silence between them. "I brought you something," she said softly. "I don't need anything," he replied, his voice flat and empty. His gaze remained fixed on the soldiers. "Leave me." Her heart ached at the coldness in his voice, but she held her ground. This was the most important battle of her life. "You're wrong," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she had. She set the tray down on a nearby weapons rack. She didn't retreat. She stood beside him, a small, quiet presence against his towering, lonely one. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear. "I'm not afraid of you, Kyle." His name. She had used it again, a deliberate choice, a bridge across the chasm he was trying to create between them. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, as if it took every ounce of his willpower, he turned his head and looked at her. The mask of the cold, indifferent king was gone. In its place was a maelstrom of raw, unguarded emotion, shock, agony, and a tiny, dangerous flicker of hope that looked beautiful and terrifying all at once. Chapter 14. The Secretary's Soul. The fragile truce between them held for the next few days. The icy wall Kyle had erected was gone, replaced by a tense, shimmering awareness. He allowed her into his orbit again, but the space between them was charged with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. He was like a wolf with a wounded paw, wary, unpredictable, and liable to bite if she moved too quickly. So she learned to be patient. She learned to speak to him not with formal reports, but with a shared glance across a crowded room, a quiet presence that asked for nothing. Seeking refuge from the tension, Alara escaped to the one place that felt truly safe: the Grand Royal Library. It was her sanctuary, a cathedral of stories where she could lose herself for hours. Tucked away in a dusty, sun-drenched alcove, she pulled out her most treasured secret: her journal. The worn, leather-bound book was filled with the soul she kept hidden from the world. She began to write, the scratching of her pen the only sound, her mind a million miles away, lost in a world of her own making. She was so lost, in fact, that she didn't hear him approach. She didn't notice the shift in the light as his large frame blocked the sun from the window. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell across her page. She gasped, her head snapping up. Kyle stood over her, his expression unreadable. His eyes were fixed on the open journal in her lap. Her blood ran cold. Terror, sharp and absolute, seized her. This was it. This was the one secret she could not bear to have exposed. It was her heart, her dreams, her defiance, all laid bare in ink. She slammed the book shut, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't." He didn't speak. He simply knelt before her, so that their eyes were on the same level. The gesture was so unexpected, so unkingly, that it stunned her into silence. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't commanding. He was waiting. Slowly, gently, he reached out his hands, palms up. An offering. A silent request. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a deeper vulnerability than any physical touch. To give him this was to give him the last part of herself that was truly her own. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see the king or the beast. She saw the lonely, wounded man from the training yard, and her choice was made. With trembling fingers, she placed the journal into his waiting hands. He accepted it with a reverence that made her throat tighten. He didn't flip through it greedily. He opened it to the page she had been writing, his touch careful on the thin paper. For a long moment, he just read, his expression softening. Then, in a voice that was nothing like his usual commanding tone, a voice that was low and soft and filled with a gentle wonder, he began to read her own words back to her. Her cage was not made of iron bars, but of the fears she carried inside her. He read, his voice a quiet murmur. And so, she learned that the key to her freedom was not in a lock that could be picked, but in a heart that could be opened. He slowly looked up from the page, his dark, intense eyes meeting hers. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the dusty sunbeam. "You are not a coward, Alara Vale," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled into dust. He saw her, not the secretary, not the Omega, not the traitor's daughter. He saw her soul, and he thought it was strong. A tear she didn't know she had been holding back slid down her cheek. Bong, bong, bong. The urgent, clanging toll of the council bell shattered the sacred silence. The outside world, with all its dangers, came rushing back in. Kale's face hardened, the soft vulnerability vanishing as the mask of the king slid back into place. He closed her journal and handed it back to her. "They are convening an emergency session," he said, his voice once again clipped and authoritative. He rose to his full, intimidating height. "Valerius has forced it." He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a grim certainty. "This is about you." Chapter 15. An Unfit Mate. They walked to the council chamber in a new, strange silence. The tender intimacy of the library felt like a dream, and this was the cold, harsh awakening. The air between them was no longer charged with unspoken desire, but with a shared, grim purpose. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a king and his greatest vulnerability, walking into a trap that had been set just for them. The chamber was full. Every Alpha Lord was present, their faces grim and expectant. Lord Valerius stood at the center of the room, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He had been waiting for this. He had been planning this. Ilara felt a chill of dread as she took her seat beside the onyx throne. She was no longer just an observer, she was the reason they were all here. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice ringing with false piety. "We come to you today not as challengers but as concerned sons of the realm. Your recent actions, your public displays of affection for this woman, have caused great unrest among the packs." "My actions are my own, Valerius," Kyle said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Speak your purpose, or be silent." "My purpose is to uphold the ancient laws of our people," Valerius declared, turning to face the assembled lords. "Our laws are clear. The king's mate, our future Luna, must be a source of strength. She must be of pure alpha blood, a she-wolf of power who can anchor the king and his beast, a Luna who can bear strong, true-blooded heirs." He spun back around, his finger pointing directly at Ilara. The accusation was a physical blow. "But what do we have here?" he shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "A wolfless Omega, the daughter of a traitor, with tainted blood and no connection to the moon goddess. She is not a source of strength. She is a weakness, an anchor that will drag our king and this entire kingdom down into the abyss." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Valerius had preyed on their deepest prejudices, their most ancient fears. "The king is compromised," he thundered, pressing his advantage. "His judgment is clouded by this creature. The law forbids such a union. She is an unfit mate." Kale shot to his feet, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury. "Valerius! The law is the law, Your Majesty." Valerius cut him off, holding up a hand. He was clever. He had wrapped his treason in the guise of tradition. "I invoke the clause of unbecoming. The council has the right, nay the duty, to formally reject a king's chosen mate if she is deemed a threat to the stability of the kingdom." The trap was sprung. Kale was caught. He was the king, but even he could not openly defy the most sacred of their ancient laws without inciting a civil war. "So I put it to you, and to this council," Valerius said, his voice ringing with triumph. "What will you choose, Your Majesty? The laws that bind us all, the throne you swore to protect, or this wolfless girl?" Ilara sat frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. The entire world narrowed to Kale's face. She saw the fury there, the raw desire to rip Valerius apart. But beneath it, she saw the agony of a king trapped by his own crown. He was going to fight for her. He was going to tear the kingdom in two for her. And she saw, with horrifying clarity, the path that lay before them. War. Death. Destruction. All because of her. The ghost of her mother's wasted face flashed in her mind. Her mother, who had died for a bond. And now, Kale was about to lead his kingdom to ruin for one. The beautiful, fragile connection they had forged in the library now seemed like the cruelest of jokes. The bond wasn't a gift of fate. It was a weapon, and their enemies were using it to destroy them. She looked at Kale's trapped, agonized face. She saw the war he was about to start, and a cold, terrible resolve formed in her heart. There was only one way to save him, one way to save the kingdom. She had to make the choice for him. She had to take the weapon out of their enemies' hands. She slowly stood, turning to face the council, her expression hardening into a mask of dreadful, heartbreaking purpose. Chapter 16. The Unspoken Vow. The world held its breath. Ilara stood before the council, a lone, slender figure in a sea of powerful, hostile men. She could feel Kale's gaze on her, a desperate, silent plea. "Don't do this," He was ready to burn his kingdom down for her. She could see it in the defiant set of his jaw, in the burgeoning golden fire in his eyes. And that was why she had to do this. She had to be the one to douse that flame, even if it meant plunging them both into darkness. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of ash. She turned her eyes from Cale's, fixing them on the triumphant, expectant face of Lord Valerius. Lord Valerius is right, she said. Her words dropped into the chamber like stones, sending ripples of shock through the assembled lords. From the throne, she heard Cale make a choked, wounded sound. A quiet, agonized, no. She didn't dare look at him. If she saw the pain on his face, her resolve would shatter. She forced herself to continue, her voice a cold, clear bell of terrible finality. I am the daughter of a man condemned for treason. I am wolfless. Each word was a nail she hammered into her own heart. I am not fit to be a Luna. I am not fit to stand beside a king. Elara, stop it! Cale's voice was a raw, broken whisper from across the room. It tore at her, a physical hook trying to pull her back from the precipice. But she couldn't stop. It was too late. She raised her chin, her gaze sweeping over the council, a queen making her final devastating decree. I will not be the weakness that tears this kingdom apart. I will not be the anchor that drags the throne into a civil war. She took one last shuddering breath, gathering all the broken pieces of her soul for the final blow. For the good of the realm, and for the stability of the crown. Her voice rang out, clear and unwavering, a terrible, perfect lie. I, Elara of House Vale, formally and completely reject Cale Draven as my fated mate. The words hung in the air, glittering and sharp as shattered glass. And then the world broke. She felt it, a tearing sensation deep inside her, as if a vital part of her soul had been ripped away. A psychic scream echoed in the space between them, a sound of pure agony that only she and Cale could hear. She risked a glance at him then. It was a mistake. The fury, the power, the golden light, it was all gone. His face was a mask of stark, uncomprehending shock. The color had drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a statue carved from gray stone. He staggered back a step, one hand flying to his chest as if she had physically stabbed him. His eyes, now a deep, bottomless brown, were filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. They were the eyes of a man whose world had just ended. Lord Valerius's cruel, triumphant smile was the last thing she saw clearly. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic. She walked out of the council chamber, each step an agony. She did not run. She did not weep. She walked like a ghost from her own grave, leaving the shattered heart of her king behind her. The great oak doors closed with a soft, final boom, sealing her away from him. Forever. Chapter 17. Echoes in an empty room. The gilded cage had become a tomb. Elara sat on the edge of the ridiculously large four-poster bed, staring at nothing. The silence in the suite was a living entity, pressing in on her from all sides. It was heavier than any sound. The bond, the warm, humming connection that had become a constant, secret comfort beneath her skin, was gone. In its place was a cold, aching void, a phantom limb that would ache for the rest of her life. She had done it. She had saved him. She had saved the kingdom. This hollow, soul-crushing agony was the price. She did not see Kyle, but the entire palace felt his pain. The guards outside her door were rigid with tension. The servants who brought her food she couldn't eat, were pale and silent, their eyes wide with fear. Whispers followed them like shadows. The king has not left his chambers. He has seen no one. He has spoken to no one. Late that first night, a sound from his adjoining rooms had made her bolt upright in bed. A crash. The distinct, violent shattering of porcelain. It was followed by a roar. Not the shout of an angry man. It was a deep, guttural sound of pure, animalistic agony, the roar of a beast whose heart had been torn out. Her sacrifice wasn't a clean cut. It was a festering wound, and she was beginning to realize, with a dawning horror, that her rejection hadn't just broken his heart, it had broken his cage. The next afternoon, there was a soft knock on her door. It wasn't a guard. It was Lady Lyra, a young, pretty lady-in-waiting with kind eyes who had always offered a gentle smile in the corridors. "My lady," Lyra said, curtsying as she entered. "I was so worried. I had to see if you were all right." Ilara just stared at her, too numb to speak. Lyra came and sat beside her on the bed, her expression one of deep sympathy. "What you did in the council chamber, it was the bravest thing I have ever seen," she whispered, placing a comforting hand on Ilara's arm. "You saved us all. You saved the kingdom from a terrible war." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they only twisted the knife of Ilara's guilt. How is he?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a dry rasp. Lyra's kind face clouded with a believable fear. "Not well," she admitted, her voice dropping lower. "His grief, it is turning into a terrible rage. The curse, without the bond to soothe it, it is growing stronger. The entire court is afraid of him, my lady. He's not himself anymore." She leaned in closer. "It is not safe for you here. What if he comes for you? In his rage, he might hurt you." The seed of fear, expertly planted, began to sprout. Ilara had seen the beast in his eyes. She had felt the points of his claws on her skin. What if Lyra was right? What if his pain made him lash out? "There are people who can help you," Lyra continued, her voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper. "People loyal to the old ways, who believe what you did was right. They can get you out of the palace. Secretly. Tonight. They can take you to a safe house in the south, where the king's wrath can never find you." Escape. The word was a siren's call. To run from this palace, from this pain, from the ghost of the man she had destroyed. It felt less like a choice and more like a desperate, primal need. To disappear completely, so he could forget her. So he could heal. "You must go, my lady," Lyra urged, her eyes wide and sincere. "It is the only way, for your safety, and for his." Ilara looked into the young woman's seemingly honest face, and her last bit of resolve crumbled. Lyra was right. She was a danger to him now, a reminder. Her presence would only feed his rage and his beast. She had to leave. It was the final, merciful act of her sacrifice. "All right," she whispered, the word tasting like defeat. "I'll go." Lyra squeezed her hand, a triumphant but gentle pressure. "I will return after dark," she promised. "Be ready." Chapter 18. The price of freedom night fell on the palace like a shroud. Ilara packed a small satchel with a change of clothes and the last of her money. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the drawstrings. Every shadow in her room seemed to twist and writhe. Every gust of wind rattling the iron-latticed windows sounded like an approaching footstep. Lyra's words had poisoned her thoughts. Was Cale out there, stalking the halls, a beast consumed by rage? Was he hunting for her? This flight wasn't just an escape anymore. It felt like a matter of survival. Just as promised, Lyra slipped into the room, a heavy, dark cloak in her hands. "It's time," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "We must be quick." She draped the cloak over Ilara, pulling the hood low to hide her face. Lyra led her not through the main corridors, but down a narrow, winding staircase used by the servants. The air was close and smelled of old stone and cooking grease. It was a world away from the gilded splendor of the royal wing. They moved like ghosts through the palace's hidden veins, emerging into a small, deserted courtyard near the kitchens. A single, unmarked carriage stood waiting in the shadows, the horses stamping their hooves impatiently in the cold. "This will take you to the southern road," Lyra explained, her voice a rushed whisper. "There will be people waiting for you at the crossroads. You will be safe. She pulled Alara into a quick, seemingly heartfelt hug. Be well, my lady. Alara climbed into the dark, musty interior of the carriage, her heart a painful knot of gratitude and grief. As the driver closed the door, she caught one last glimpse of Lyra. The kind-faced lady-in-waiting was giving a small, almost imperceptible nod to the cloaked driver. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air snaked down Alara's spine. Something was wrong. The carriage lurched forward with a crack of the whip. Alara peered through the small, grimy window, expecting to see the lights of the capital city. But the carriage didn't turn south. It rumbled over the cobblestones and headed north toward the dark, menacing expanse of the woods. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. This wasn't the way. She lunged for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It had been locked from the outside. She was trapped. She banged on the wall of the carriage, shouting, but there was no response. The carriage just picked up speed, plunging deeper and deeper into the forest. After what felt like an eternity, it finally shuddered to a halt in a dark, silent clearing. Before Alara could even process what was happening, the door was wrenched open. But it wasn't the driver who stood there. It was Lord Vorlag. His cruel, triumphant smile was illuminated by the moonlight, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Did you really think it would be so easy, little bird? He purred, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. Freedom has a price. Rough hands grabbed her, dragging her from the carriage and throwing her to the damp, cold earth. Vorlag loomed over her, a massive, predatory shadow. Lady Lyra has been a most persuasive friend, he chuckled. She sends her regards. Betrayal, so complete and absolute, crashed over her, leaving her breathless. Lyra. It had all been a lie. And just so you know, Vorlag continued, enjoying every moment of her despair, a message is already on its way back to your heartbroken king. A message, sealed with your forged signature, explaining how you fled your gilded cage willingly, how you sought sanctuary with me. He crouched down, his face close to hers. It will explain how you chose his greatest rival over him. Your rejection broke his heart. This will break his mind. The world dissolved into a nightmare. This was her lowest point, her all-is-lost moment. She had been played for a fool. Her sacrifice, her agonizing choice, it had all been for nothing. She wasn't saving Kale. She had just handed his enemies the perfect weapon to shatter what was left of his sanity. Captured, betrayed. She had become the final, devastating instrument of his destruction. As Vorlag's men bound her hands with rough rope, she looked back toward the distant, mocking lights of the palace, a cold, dead stone in her chest. She had lost. And in losing, she had just condemned the man she now knew she loved to a living hell. Chapter 19. A Curse of Two Bloodlines. Despair was a cold physical thing. It was the damp stone floor of the cell, the rough hemp of the ropes that bound her wrists, and the suffocating darkness that pressed in on her. Alara was a prisoner in Lord Vorlag's northern war camp, a spoil of a war she hadn't even known she was fighting. The triumphant, cruel look on Vorlag's face as he'd left her here was burned into her mind. He had won. Her sacrifice had been a fool's errand, twisted into the very weapon that would destroy Kale. The thought was a stone in her gut, dragging her down into a bottomless pit of grief. She must have drifted into a state of numb shock, because the next thing she knew, voices outside her cell door pulled her back to the horrifying present. It was Vorlag, his voice a low, gloating rumble, and with him was Lord Valerius. The traitor had come north. The palace is in chaos, Valerius said, his voice slick with satisfaction. The king has not been seen. He has taken no food. The guards hear him, changing. The rejection from the mate has broken him, just as we planned. It is even better than we hoped, Vorlag replied, and the smugness in his tone made Alara's skin crawl. Her little act of self-sacrifice was the key. My spies in the royal archives confirmed the old texts. The Draven curse isn't just a matter of controlling the beast within. It's an ancient pact tied directly to her bloodline. Alara froze, the cold in her veins turning to ice. Her bloodline? Valerius made a questioning sound. What do you mean, tied to her? The first Lycan king was saved from the curse by the first Vale matriarch, a powerful healer, Vorlag explained, his voice filled with the pleasure of revealing a devastating secret. They forged a bond, a pact between their bloodlines. The curse can only be soothed, truly controlled by the willing acceptance of a Vale mate. Without it, without that anchor, the curse isn't just untamed. He paused for dramatic effect. It becomes permanent. The world tilted, the damp floor seeming to fall away beneath her. Permanent. The blood moon is in 2 nights, Valerius mused, the sound of his voice filled with greedy anticipation. So when it rises, Vorlag finished. Kale Draven will be nothing more than a mindless, raging beast. We will be forced to put him down like a rabid dog for the good of the kingdom. A dry, humorless chuckle. And then, my friend, with my support from the north, the onyx throne will be yours. The words struck Alara not like a blow, but like a bolt of lightning. It burned away the fog of her despair, incinerating her grief and leaving behind something new, something white-hot and forged in the deepest fires of her soul. Fury. Her entire life, her entire worldview had been a lie. She had seen the bond as a cage, a curse upon women. But she was wrong. It was the cure. Her acceptance wasn't a submission, it was the key. Her rejection hadn't been a noble sacrifice to save him from a political trap. It had been the act that loaded the gun, cocked the hammer, and placed his head in the crosshairs. The image of her mother, pale and wasting away, flashed in her mind. Her mother had accepted her fate. She had let a broken heart kill her, a quiet, passive victim of a cruel world. No. The word was a silent scream in Alara's mind. Not me. She would not be her mother. She would not let her mistake be the end of him. Her love for him, and in that moment, she finally admitted it to herself with blinding clarity. She loved him, was not a weakness. It was the only weapon that could save him. The despair was gone, burned away. In its place was a cold, hard, diamond-sharp resolve. She had to get back to him. She had to fix this. She began to test the ropes on her wrists, her eyes scanning the dark, damp confines of her cell. The secretary's mind, always observing, always cataloging details, was now fully awake, and it was plotting an escape. Chapter 20. The Shadow's Gambit. The following day, Alara transformed. The weeping, broken prisoner vanished. In her place was a strategist, a shadow, using her own perceived weakness as her greatest strength. She spent hours observing the guards through the small barred window in her cell door. There were 2 of them, brutish and bored. They changed shifts every 4 hours. The morning guard was old and grizzled. The afternoon guard, however, was young, barely more than a boy, with a cocky swagger and eyes that kept straying to the serving girls in the camp. He was the weak link. Her plan was desperate. It was foolish. And it was the only one she had. When the young guard brought her midday meal, a chunk of dry bread and a bowl of watery stew, she didn't touch it. She lay on the straw pallet, facing the wall, her body racked with loud, convincing sobs. "Not hungry, little bird?" The guard sneered, his voice full of youthful arrogance. "Don't worry, once Lord Vorlag is king, you'll have a much nicer cage." She continued to cry, ignoring him. She did the same when he brought the evening meal. By the time he came for the final check of the night, she had been crying for nearly 8 hours straight. Her throat was raw and her head pounded. "Still at it?" He sighed, clearly annoyed. He unlocked the door to retrieve the untouched food trays. "You can cry all you want. No one's coming to save you." That was her moment. As he bent down to pick up the bowls, she let out a final, wretched sob and threw herself backward on the pallet, as if collapsing from pure exhaustion. The movement was just enough of a distraction. For a split second, his attention was on her. And in that second, she acted. She wasn't a warrior. She was a secretary. Her weapons were knowledge and precision. She shot her legs out, not kicking him, but hooking her ankle around his. It was a clumsy, desperate move, but his hands were full, and his balance was off. He stumbled forward with a surprised yelp, trying to keep the trays from spilling. He crashed into the far wall, his head hitting the stone with a dull thud. He slid to the floor, stunned and groaning. She was on him in an instant. Her hands, shaking with adrenaline, fumbled at his belt for the heavy iron keyring. He tried to grab her, but he was dazed, his movements slow. She found the keys, her fingers closing around the cold metal. Freedom. She scrambled back, crab walking away from him as he struggled to his feet. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut just as he lunged for it. With trembling hands, she found the right key and turned it in the lock. The heavy clunk of the bolt sliding home was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The guard roared in frustration, throwing his shoulder against the door. It shuddered but held firm. Alara didn't wait to see if it would last. She was free from the cell, but she was still deep inside an enemy war camp. The moon was beginning to rise, a pale, ominous sliver in the sky. Tonight. The blood moon was tonight. There was no time. She slipped down the dark, quiet corridor, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She was no longer Alara Vale, the king's shadow. She was a survivor, a woman with a purpose. She emerged from the prison tent into the cold night air, the sounds of the raucous, oblivious war camp all around her. The alarm would be raised at any moment. She pulled her dark cloak tighter, melting into the shadows at the edge of the firelight, and ran. She ran for the darkness of the forest, for the man she had to save, for a life she refused to let be decided by anyone but herself. Chapter 21. Race Against the Moon. The forest was a nightmare of tangled roots and grasping branches. Alara ran, her lungs burning, the cold night air slicing into her throat. Behind her, she could hear the first faint sounds of alarm from Vorlag's camp. Shouts, the baying of hounds. They were hunting her. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, but it was drowned out by a more powerful, more urgent fear. The moon. It was climbing the sky, its pale silver light beginning to bleed into a sick, ominous crimson. The blood moon. Her mind was a frantic mantra. Get to Kale. I have to save him. This is my fault. The love she had denied for so long was now a fire in her veins, a burning, desperate fuel that pushed her body past the limits of its endurance. This was no longer about fate. This was about choice. Her choice. Her responsibility. Her love. The northern forest was a living, breathing enemy. Thorns tore at her dress and her skin. An unseen root sent her sprawling to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from her. She lay there for a precious second, gasping on the cold, damp earth, the taste of dirt and blood in her mouth. The sounds of pursuit were closer now. She could hear the distinct, terrifying howl of a wolf on her trail. Vorlag's wolves. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest, and pushed onward. She came to a river, a rushing torrent of black, ice-cold water. There was no bridge, no time to find one. She plunged in without a second thought. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath and numbing her limbs. The current tried to pull her under, to dash her against the rocks, but she fought it, her teeth clenched, her eyes fixed on the far bank. She clawed her way out on the other side, shivering and soaked, but alive. The river would mask her scent, buying her precious time. She climbed a rocky ridge, her fingers raw and bleeding as she pulled herself up the sharp stones. From the top, she could see for miles. And there, in the distance, she saw it. The palace. Its familiar spires were stark black silhouettes against the now glowing blood-red moon. It wasn't a comforting sight. It looked like a wounded beast, crowned with a bleeding, malevolent eye. And as if in answer to her thought, a sound drifted on the wind from the castle, a roar, a long, inhuman sound of pure, untamed agony and rage. It was a sound that vibrated in her bones, a sound her very soul recognized. Kale. The beast was breaking free. The curse was taking him. Panic, cold and absolute, gave her a final burst of strength. She scrambled down the other side of the ridge, ignoring the cuts and bruises. She ran across the open fields leading to the palace, no longer trying to hide. The alarms were ringing now, not from the camp behind her, but from the palace walls ahead. A different kind of alarm. Not for an escaped prisoner, but for a monster loose within. The sounds of fighting grew louder as she approached. Screams, the clash of steel. Another of those terrifying roars, closer this time, filled with a pain that shattered her heart. She didn't head for the main gate. She knew a small, little-used postern gate in the garden wall, one she had used to slip out for fresh air on lonely nights. Praying it was unlocked, she threw her shoulder against it. It groaned, then burst open. She stumbled into the heart of chaos. The palace gardens were a war zone. Guards were battling something, a blur of black fur and fury that moved with impossible speed. She could hear the shattering of glass from the great hall, see the flicker of overturned torches. She had made it back, but as she stared at the carnage, at the beautiful home now consumed by violence, a single horrifying thought screamed through her mind. She was too late. Chapter 22. To Claim a King. Alara burst into the throne room, the chaos of the gardens spilling in behind her like a dark tide. The scene before her was a nightmare. The grand chamber, usually a place of imposing order, was destroyed. Priceless tapestries were torn from the walls, heavy oak furniture was smashed into splinters, and the lords of the council cowered behind pillars like frightened children. In the center of the destruction was Kale, or the thing that had once been Kale. He was on all fours, a monstrous shape of shifting shadow and muscle, more beast than man. His body shuddered with the violent, uncontrolled spasms of his transformation. His eyes, when he lifted his head, were not the dark, soulful eyes of the man she loved. They were solid, blazing gold, lit from within by a mindless, agonizing fire. A low, continuous growl of pure pain and rage rumbled in his chest. The architects of this nightmare stood by, watching their victory unfold. Lord Valerius stood near the onyx throne, his face a mask of cold, reptilian triumph. "You see?" he shouted to the cowering lords. "The curse has consumed him. He is no longer your king. He is an animal that must be put down." At the other end of the room, Lord Vorlog and his personal guard advanced slowly, their swords drawn and gleaming in the torchlight. "A sad day," Vorlog sneered, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "But a necessary one. We will end this animal's suffering." Alara saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to the tormented, struggling creature in the center of the room. He was the only thing that mattered. She ignored the shouts, the drawn steel, the political poison that filled the air. She took a step forward, her tattered, mud-stained dress a stark contrast to the silks and velvets of the court. The beast turned its head, the golden eyes locking onto her. The growl deepened, a warning rumble that shook the very floor. It did not know her. She didn't stop. She kept walking, her steps steady, her heart a wild, frantic drum. This was it. The final test. She could feel the stares of the entire court on her, 100 pairs of eyes watching her walk toward her own death. But all she could see was him. "Kale," she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. She stopped just before him, close enough to feel the heat rolling off his powerful body. The beast snarled, its lips pulling back to reveal terrifyingly long canines. She was afraid, but her love was stronger than her fear. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it gently on the side of his massive, furry head. The beast flinched but did not pull away. And then, with all the love, all the fury, all the unwavering resolve in her soul, she spoke the words that would change the world. "I choose you." Before anyone could react, she leaned in. She closed her eyes, and in a move that defied every law of nature and Lycan tradition, she sank her teeth into the thick muscle of his neck. It was not a bite of aggression, it was not a wound, it was a mark, a claim, the impossible act of a wolfless Omega claiming a Lycan king as her own. The world exploded in a silent flash of golden light. A shockwave of pure, untamed energy erupted from the point of contact, a raw power that came not from him, but from her choice. The bond between them didn't just reform, it ignited, a blazing inferno forged in the crucible of her love. Cale roared, a sound of both supreme agony and ecstatic release. The monstrous form shuddered, convulsed, and then began to recede. The fur melted away, the claws retracted, the beast retreated, caged once more not by a curse but by her claim. He rose to his full height, no longer a monster on the floor, but a man, a king. He stood before her, his body trembling, his eyes clear, sane, and fixed on her face with an expression of such raw, absolute devotion that it made her knees weak. They stood together in the center of the stunned, silent throne room, bound by a power none of them had ever witnessed before. And they were untouchable. Chapter 23, The Traitor's Debt. The silence in the throne room was absolute. It was a silence born of shock, of disbelief, of witnessing the impossible. Every lord, every guard, every single person stared at the king and his secretary, now bound together by a shimmering, palpable aura of power. Cale took a slow, deep breath, the first breath of a man whose soul had just been returned to him. He looked down at Alara, a soft, wondering smile touching his lips. Then, he turned his gaze upon his enemies. And the king returned. His eyes, clear and sharp as obsidian, landed on Lord Valerius. The traitor's smug, triumphant expression had curdled into a mask of ashen, sputtering terror. He looked from Cale to Alara and back again, his mind clearly unable to process what had just happened. "You spoke of the law, Valerius," Cale said, his voice dangerously quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "You spoke of what makes one fit to rule. Let us discuss it." Before the Lord could respond, Alara took a step forward. Her dress was torn, her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes blazed with a fire that matched the king's. She reached into the bodice of her gown and pulled out the crumpled, precious letter she had stolen from the archives. "You questioned my bloodline, my lord," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she had never known she possessed. "You called my family's name a disgrace. Here is the truth of yours." She held the letter out to Cale. He took it, his eyes scanning the page, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, righteous fury. He held the letter up for the entire court to see. "A confession," he announced, his voice like the crack of a whip. "From my own father. A letter detailing a conspiracy to frame and murder a loyal and honorable man, Lord Alistair Vale." He locked his gaze on the trembling traitor. "A conspiracy orchestrated by a man who still sits on my council, a man whose greed and ambition knew no bounds, Lord Valerius." Valerius fell to his knees, his face a mess of terror. "Lies! Forgery! The girl is a witch!" "Silence," Cale commanded, and the word held the weight of a mountain. He strode toward the cowering lord. "For 20 years you have lived a lie. You have sat at my table and advised my rule, while the blood of a good man stained your hands." He stood over him, a figure of absolute final judgment. The price for treason is blood. It is a debt that must be paid. Kyle did not wait for a trial. He did not wait for a confession. He drew his own blade, its silver surface gleaming in the torchlight. With a single, swift movement, a king's justice was done. He turned from the body to face Lord Vorlag, whose men had lowered their weapons, their faces pale with shock. "You chose the wrong ally," Cale stated, his voice devoid of emotion. Vorlag and his men were surrounded by the royal guard, their rebellion over before it had truly begun. Finally, Cale turned back to the stunned council. He raised his voice, his royal authority absolute. "By order of the crown, The name of Lord Alistair Vale is cleared of all wrongdoing. His title, his lands, and his honor are hereby restored to his house, to his daughter." He walked back to Alara, his eyes softening as they met hers. He stopped before her, not as a king addressing a subject, but as a man speaking to his equal. "Your father was a good man, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was 20 years overdue. "And his daughter is a queen." Chapter 24. A Choice of Scars. The throne room was finally quiet. The traitors were gone, one to his death, the others to the dungeons. The council had been dismissed, leaving a trail of shocked and fearful whispers in their wake. Alara and Kyle stood alone amidst the wreckage of his throne room, the ruins of their old lives. The air was thick with the scent of spilled blood and the dust of broken things, but for the first time, it felt clean. The shadows of the past had been banished by the harsh, unrelenting light of the truth. Cale walked to her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped before her, his face a canvas of emotions she was only just learning to read. Gratitude, awe, regret, and a deep, soul-shattering love. "Alara," he began, his voice soft, almost hesitant. He gently reached out and took her hands in his. They were strong and warm. "Tonight, you proved that the bond is not a chain of fate. It is a choice." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, sending a shiver of warmth through her. "My father tried to chain me to his legacy of cruelty. Valerius and Vorlog tried to chain you to your family's shame. I will not be another tyrant in your life. I will not make that same mistake." He took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers, giving her all of his vulnerability, all of his truth. "You are free," he said, the words clear and absolute. "Truly free. Stay here, with me. Rule by my side, not as my possession, but as my queen, my partner, my equal in all things." He paused, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "Or, walk away. Leave this place. With your family's name restored and your future your own. I will not stop you. I will not chain you." He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had. A true choice. She looked at him, the king who had nearly torn his world apart for her, the beast who had held back his claws, the broken boy who had been forced to condemn her father. She saw all the scars he carried, scars that mirrored her own. Her choice wasn't even a choice. It was a certainty, a destination she had been running toward her entire life without ever knowing it. A genuine smile, the first she had felt in years, touched her lips. "My choice," she said, her voice full of a peace that felt like coming home, "was made in a dark forest with your hounds at my heels and your roar in my heart. I didn't run back here to clear my father's name, Cale. I ran back here for you." She squeezed his hands, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not staying because of fate. I'm staying because I love you." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was heartbreaking. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, his strong body trembling against hers. "And I love you," he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. "More than the moon, more than my own life." Later, in the quiet solitude of his chambers, they sealed their bond. It was not the desperate, frantic act she had once imagined. It was a slow, tender exploration, a sacrament of two broken souls choosing to mend together. Trembling hands traced old scars. Gentle mouths whispered forgotten dreams. It was not a king claiming his secretary. It was not a beast taming his mate. It was just Cale and Alara, two survivors who had walked through the fire and found each other in the ashes. They stood on the balcony as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. It was a new dawn, for them and for the kingdom. A sense of profound peace settled over Alara as she leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, human heartbeat she had saved. The future was theirs to write. But far below, at the edge of the ancient woods that bordered the palace grounds, a shadowy figure watched the two lovers on the balcony. a low whisper, carried away by the morning breeze, curled from unseen lips. Enjoy your peace, little king, for the curse is not broken, it merely sleeps, and your child will be the one to reawaken it.